At 6:47 a.m. on March 12, 1944, a 20-year-old American corporal knelt in a ditch outside Cassino, Italy, holding a single strand of rusty barbed wire, and knowing with absolute clarity that in the next 90 seconds, either that wire would kill a German armored scout car, or that scout car would find his friends and erase them from the earth. No hero speech, no dramatic orders, no backup. Just mud in his boots, 11 dead men in his memory, and a choice the manuals never mentioned: obey the rules and watch more boys die or break them and maybe, just maybe, save an entire company. This is the kind of story war buries the quiet, brutal moments when one unknown soldier rewrites the way armies fight and then goes home like nothing happened. You were never meant to hear about him, but you're here. If you're watching this video on WW2 Secrets, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you first heard or are hearing for the very first time the story of James Dalton. At 6:47 a.m. on March 12, 1944, Corporal James "Jimmy" Dalton lay pressed into a trench of cold Italian mud, the kind that clings to your skin like it wants to pull you under. The fog over the Leary Valley hung low and heavy, swallowing sound, swallowing color, swallowing everything except the growl of a German six-cylinder engine crawling toward him. 15 miles an hour, slow enough to taunt him, fast enough to kill everyone behind him. He had no bazooka, no mines, no grenades, not even permission to do what he was about to do. All he had was 30 feet of rusted barbed wire looped 3 times around the handle of a standard-issue entrenching shovel, an object every officer in the 34th Infantry Division had explicitly, repeatedly, almost violently forbidden him from using as a weapon. The field manuals were clear. There were 16 acceptable ways to disable light armor. Dalton's idea appeared in none of them. In fact, he'd already been threatened with a court-martial twice for suggesting it. But rules lose their weight when you've watched 11 friends die in 3 weeks. Because your unit doesn't have the equipment, those rules assume you have. Dalton's hands shook as he pulled the wire taut. The damp morning air tasted like iron. Somewhere in the fog ahead, the SDKFZ WW2 drifted closer, its commander leaning out of the open hatch, bored, scanning lazily with binoculars because, why be afraid when the Americans can't touch you? Dalton knew he had one chance. One. The wire trembled between his palms and, for a moment, he wasn't in Italy at all. He was back in Gary, Indiana, standing between rail cars and the hissing steam of the U.S. steel yards. His father's boots thudded across the catwalk above the furnace's 15-hour shifts in a world of fire and metal that paid barely enough to feed 6 kids. Jimmy, the middle child, spent more afternoons among busted couplings and oil-slick track than in any classroom. He learned early that machines don't care about your rank, your age, or how scared you are. They break the same way every time if you pay attention. By 17, he was apprenticing as a switchman, seeing the world not as a line of tasks, but as a system of failures, waiting to chain together a loose coupler pin that could derail 6 cars of frayed cable that could whip back and kill a brakeman. And if you didn't have the right tools, you made do. You patched with scrap iron rope wire, whatever kept people alive long enough to finish a shift. Those instincts followed him into the Army in January 1943. The recruiter promised him training, steady pay, a chance to see the world. What he got was 8 rushed weeks of basic a rifle he'd never fired before, and a cramped troopship headed to North Africa. By the time he reached Italy in September, he'd already learned the first truth of war. The recruiter had lied about everything, except the part where the world would be bigger than he expected, and far crueler. The 34th Infantry Division ground its way up the Italian peninsula, inch by inch, village by village, ridge by ridge. German machine guns waited on every slope. Even worse was what came at dawn and dusk: reconnaissance cars. Fast, hard to hit, armed with enough firepower to map your position and call down artillery that would kill you 12 hours later. The dreaded SDKFZ, 222 4 wheels, a 20mm autocannon, an MG-34, and the freedom to appear and vanish like a ghost. And now, one of them was rolling straight toward Dalton's wire. He steadied his breath. This was it. Jimmy Dalton's story doesn't begin in Italy, or in the army, or even in the war. It begins in Gary, Indiana, a city built from steel sweat, and the stubbornness of people who learned to survive with whatever life didn't take from them. His father came home from U.S. Steel every night with burn scars that glowed like old embers, the smell of furnace heat still trapped in his clothes. 15-hour shifts, 6 kids, and a paycheck that seemed to evaporate the moment it arrived. In houses like theirs, there was no room for fragility. Everyone worked. Everyone learned fast. Jimmy learned fastest in the rail yards. Those yards were his school, his playground, his laboratory. While other boys memorized dates and state capitals, Jimmy memorized the groan of couplers under tension, the whistle patterns of incoming freights, the hairline cracks that told him a cable was about to snap. He spent afternoons with his hands deep in machinery, older than his father, knowing which cars carried grain, which carried coal, and which were one broken pin away from disaster. Railroads teach a harsh, almost beautiful logic. Everything is connected. Everything can fail, and failure is almost always fatal. A single loose pin could send 6 boxcars tumbling off the track. A frayed brake cable could whip back and cut a man in half. Jimmy learned to see these chain reactions before they happened. Learned to improvise with wire rope rusted bolts because the rail yard never ordered new parts unless something had already gone catastrophically wrong. By 17, he was apprenticing as a switchman, the kind of job where you carry not fear, but respect. Respect for weight momentum, and the fact that steel only listens if you understand it. Those lessons hardened into instinct long before he ever put on a uniform. In January 1943, 3 months after turning 19, he enlisted. The recruiter talked about opportunity and adventure, but the truth arrived fast. 8 weeks of basic, a rifle he barely knew how to hold, then straight onto a transport ship bound for North Africa. No glamour, no grand speeches, just seasickness, cramped bunks, and boys who seemed to grow older by the hour. By September 1943, he was in Italy with the 34th Infantry Division, the Red Bulls. They clawed their way up the peninsula like men pushing against a millstone. Every ridgeline hid an MG-42. Every village had been turned into a fortress. But the worst enemy wasn't infantry or tanks. It was reconnaissance. SDKFZ 222 scout cars, sleek, fast, armored, just enough to shrug off rifle fire, slipped through the mountains at dawn and dusk. They didn't need to kill you themselves. They only needed to see you. 12 hours later, the artillery would do the rest. American doctrine said to stop them with bazookas, mines, anti-tank rifles. But the 34th Division had 9 bazookas for the entire front. The other weapons, either obsolete or unavailable. So men died. One patrol at a time. One foxhole at a time. And Jimmy watched, and remembered, and began quietly to calculate. The first to die was Eddie Kowalski, February 18, 1944, just after dawn, the hour when the cold settles deepest in your bones and the fog hides everything except the things that want to kill you. A SDKFZ 222 rolled past his foxhole like it owned the valley. Eddie fired his M1 Garand, out of instinct more than hope. The bullets sparked uselessly off the armor, little flashes of defiance swallowed by steel. The MG-34 replied. 3 rounds. Center mass. Eddie was 20 years old, a machinist's son from Pittsburgh, the kind of kid who still kept his mother's last Christmas letter folded in his breast pocket. He died before anyone could pull him back into cover. 5 days later, it was Mike Brennan. February 23rd. Another dawn. Another patrol. Mike had been the one who taught Dalton how to set a proper fighting position, how to dig your foxhole in a way that kept you alive, how to read the ground, the way a switchman reads a rail line with respect. He tried to hit the 222 with a grenade from 30 yards. It bounced short. The 20mm autocannon didn't. Mike was 24, Brooklyn-born, 4 sisters who adored him. His mother got the telegram on March 2nd. Then came Corporal Luis Vargas, March 4th. Vargas was the one who shared cigarettes even when he had only 3 left. Rodeo stories from El Paso. A laugh that somehow cut through the misery of the Rapido Valley. He never got a chance to throw anything. The 222 drove straight through the company's position at dusk, spraying fire like it was trimming weeds. Vargas was running for a better angle when the autocannon found him. The medic tried. He really did. But some wounds don't give you time. By early March 47, men in the 34th Infantry Division had been killed by reconnaissance vehicles, not in battles, not in assaults, not in heroic last stands. Just by fast armored scout cars doing their job, while the Americans had nothing capable of stopping them. Each loss carved something out of Dalton. These weren't statistics. They were voices he remembered in the dark. Hands he'd shoved into the mud trying to pull them back. Boots he'd helped lace. Men he'd eaten cold rations beside. Every death felt preventable. That was the worst part. Preventable. And the battalion's official response: maintain defensive posture. Conserve anti-tank assets. Await resupply. Dalton sat in the back of that dim, smoky barn as Captain Morrison, a uniform too clean, boots not yet broken in, told 20 exhausted soldiers that help was coming within the month. They were supposed to hold the line with discipline, with patience, with faith in equipment they didn't have. Dalton wasn't angry at Morrison. He was angry at the system that told men in mud to wait for permission to save themselves. So when he raised his hand and offered a simple idea, stretching wire low across the roads the 222s always used, he wasn't trying to be clever. He was trying to keep someone else from being zipped into a canvas bag. Morrison shot it down instantly. "Corporal, that is not an authorized anti-vehicle obstacle. We will not be rigging booby traps." Dismissed. Dalton didn't argue, didn't protest. But as he stepped outside into the cold March air, something inside him hardened. The rail yards had taught him a simple truth: when failure keeps killing people, you fix the system even if no one gives you permission. That night, after Chen and Harrison died under yet another 222's gunfire, Dalton stopped waiting. He began planning. Dalton waited until midnight. Waited until the company settled into that uneasy half-sleep. Soldiers know too well the kind where your body lies still in a foxhole, but your mind keeps rehearsing the last scream you heard. The cold of March pressed against him as he crawled out of the American lines and into the dark alone. No permission, no backup, no witnesses. Only the thin hope that improvisation might succeed where doctrine had failed. The mud sucked at his boots with every step, a wet, slurping reminder that if a German patrol saw him out here, he wouldn't be captured, he'd be silenced. The Rapido River Valley was quiet in that unnerving Italian way. Distant artillery, muttering like an argument on the horizon wind, threading through the olive trees, the earth itself seeming to listen. Dalton kept low, scanning for silhouettes, and listening for the mechanical heartbeat of an engine. Nothing. Not yet. He reached the narrow stretch of road, a sliver of dirt pressed between 2 gnarled oak trees, just wide enough for a 222. He chose this spot because it offered everything cover, from Allied eyes concealment, from German approach, and a perfect natural choke point. If the bay worked anywhere, it would work here. Dalton drove the first entrenching shovel into the earth. 6 inches. Not enough. He braced with his foot hammered with a rock, drove it down to 12. Solid. The second shovel went in 18 feet across, paced out in the darkness, each step a quiet defiance of the rules he was supposed to follow. Then came the wire. He uncoiled it slowly, the barbs biting into his palms, tearing thin lines into cold skin. 3 loops around the first shovel handle. Tight. Another 3 loops on the second. He stretched the wire across the road, lowering it, until it hovered exactly 14 inches off the ground, axle height for a SDKFZ 222. He knew this because 2 weeks earlier, he'd knelt beside the burned-out hull of one and measured it with his boot. He tested the tension. Too loose and the wire would snap. Too tight and the car might pass over without incident. He adjusted. Tested again. A faint, humming vibration thrummed under his fingers like a plucked rail line. Perfect. 23 minutes. That's all it took to break military doctrine. Dalton crouched in the ditch afterward, breathing hard, watching the empty road. The night seemed to press down on him as if waiting to decide whether to reward this disobedience or bury it. He buried the wire under a thin skin of mud, just enough to make it disappear in the half-light of dawn. The shovels, rusted and filthy, looked like abandoned tools. Nothing out of the ordinary until it was too late. At 1:15 a.m., he crawled back toward American lines, his heartbeat loud enough he swore the Germans could hear it. If an officer found out, court-martial. If the bay failed, men would die anyway. If it worked, maybe someone would see another sunrise. He lay in his foxhole until dawn, staring into the fog thickening across the valley like draped cotton. The wire was out there, silent, invisible, patient. At 6:43 a.m. on March 12th, the sound arrived, first the soft, predatory whine of a German engine. Dalton froze. The 222 emerged from the mist like a phantom, the commander standing tall from the hatch, scanning with binoculars, casual, confident, untouchable. The gunner rotated the 20mm lazily, more bored than alert. 600 yards, 500, 400. Dalton felt his pulse pounding in his throat. If the car spotted them, artillery would fall by afternoon. If the trap didn't work, he'd doom them anyway. If it did, 300 yards, 200. The engine growled louder. The wheels churned through the mud, flinging brown arcs behind them. 50 yards from the wire, Dalton could see every spoke, every glistening bead of mud on the tires. And then, 6:47 a.m., the wire caught. The right wheel locked mid-spin. The axle jerked sideways with the force of a fist the size of a freight train. Momentum did the rest. The nose dipped. The rear lifted. For a heartbeat, the vehicle hung in the air like a fish, hooked by an invisible line. Then it flipped. Once, twice. A third time, each rotation tearing metal and spraying mud in wide, violent spirals. It crashed upside down with a shriek of steel. Dalton didn't allow himself a breath of victory. He grabbed his M1, sprinting toward the wreck as other soldiers burst from their foxholes. The engine still whined upside down. The wheels spun uselessly in the air. The commander lay twisted on the ground, thrown clear, neck broken. The gunner was pinned unconscious. The driver crawled out through shattered glass, dazed and bleeding, a boy no older than Dalton himself. He raised shaking hands. No fight left. Dalton hauled him out by the collar and shoved him toward Private Morrison. And then his eyes caught the wire, still wrapped around the axle, still attached to the shovels, now dragged 20 feet from where he'd planted them. He had seconds. He tore the wire loose, coiled. It shoved it into his pack before anyone could see what had really brought the German machine down. Captain Morrison arrived minutes later, circling the wreck, baffled. No mines, no bazooka, no blast marks. "Corporal, scout cars don't just flip." Dalton met his stare. "Yes, sir." No explanation. No confession. Just a lie heavy enough to save lives. By noon, every soldier knew the official story didn't make sense. But no one talked. Not yet. Dalton went back to cleaning his rifle, the faint sting of wire cuts still burning in his palms. Private Morrison found Dalton that afternoon, sitting on an overturned ammunition crate, cleaning his rifle, the way some men pray with quiet focus, steady hands and a mind far away. Morrison crouched beside him, voice low, cautious, like someone approaching a wild animal, not sure if it's wounded or waiting to strike. "What really happened out there?" Jimmy Dalton didn't look up. Car flipped. Jimmy Morrison whispered, "I saw the wire in your pack." "The shovels." "I know what I saw." Dalton froze. They'd grown up 5 blocks apart in Gary. 2 kids who once skipped stones across the same polluted river now found themselves in Italy, fighting a war neither had asked for. If anyone could understand the weight of 11 dead men, it was Morrison. "You didn't see anything," Dalton said quietly. Morrison held his gaze. "If I did see something, could it work again?" Dalton hesitated, A long, heavy pause loaded with fear and possibility. "Yes, then teach me." That night, long after lights out, long after the captain had zipped himself into his clean sleeping bag, Dalton led Morrison into the trees north of their line. No moon, no sound except distant gunfire bouncing off the hills. Dalton moved like a man retracing steps he had memorized in blood. Morrison followed, shoulders tight, breath fogging in the cold. Dalton showed him everything: the placement of the shovels, the exact pacing to measure distance, the tension in the wire, the tiny adjustments that meant the difference between a broken line and a flipped vehicle. By the end, Morrison's hands were bleeding from barbs, but he was smiling. For the first time in weeks, someone had handed him a weapon that actually worked. Word spread the way all forbidden things do in the Army, whisper to whisper, foxhole to foxhole, through the quiet underground network that exists beneath every chain of command. Morrison taught 2 others. Those 2 taught 4. Within a week, 6 men knew how to rig the trap. Dalton never bragged. He never instructed. He didn't have to. The idea had escaped him and taken on a life of its own. Private Jackson set one on the road to San Pietro. Private Ali rigged another near the Garigliano River. Corporal Williams stretched his wire across a narrow forest trail the Germans used at night. None of them had permission. None filed reports. They just did it. And the results came quickly. March 18th, Jackson's wire took out another 222, flipped it end over end, killing the commander, injuring the rest. Jackson removed the wire before anyone arrived. March 21st, Ali's trap didn't flip the vehicle, but it smashed the front axle hard enough that the German crew abandoned it. Lived to fight another day, but without their precious scout car. By March 25th, reconnaissance in the 34th Division sector had plummeted by 60%. The sudden drop in aggressiveness stunned American commanders. They didn't know why the Germans had grown skittish, moving slower, taking detours, checking every road on foot. But the soldiers on the ground did. Something had changed. Something invisible. Something that felt like justice. Across enemy lines, Lieutenant Klaus Richter of the 29th Panzer Grenadier Division sensed it too. He commanded 3 SDKFZ 222s, experienced crews, hardened veterans men who had spent months haunting the valleys around Casino like armored ghosts. Yet in 2 weeks, 3 of his scout cars had been destroyed under circumstances that bordered on impossible. On March 27th, Richter pushed up his sleeves and crawled beneath the wreck of Vehicle 237 himself. Bent axle, no explosive residue, no fragmentation, no penetration, just a twisted undercarriage and a set of strange horizontal scrapes etched into the wheel housing. He found it a small, rusted barb lodged deep in the wheel well. Wire, deliberate, placed at axle height. Impossible, and yet the only explanation that fit. Richter filed a report. German intelligence dismissed it at first. Barbed wire cannot stop armor. But the pattern was undeniable. Interrogations of American prisoners revealed nothing. Searches of American dead turned up no documentation. Someone out there was breaking the rules, and it was working. By early April, German scout cars were under new orders: slow down, inspect roads, dismount if anything looks suspicious. Trained elite crews were reduced to creeping through Casino like hunted animals. And still officially, the Americans had no idea why. On the front lines, the men just smiled into their rations, pretending not to notice that the dawns were suddenly quieter, and that for the first time in weeks, no one had died at daybreak. Captain Morrison discovered the truth by accident. April 3, 1944. He was making his routine inspection along a logging road east of the company's sector when he spotted movement. Corporal Williams, hunched low, driving a shovel into the ground, like a man trying to bury a secret before it grew too loud. Morrison stepped closer. Then he saw it: the shovels, the tensioned wire, the unmistakable geometry of a trap he had explicitly forbidden. Private Morrison said, voice clipped, "Step away from that." Williams froze. His face went pale. Morrison walked up, knelt beside the setup, and tested the tension with 2 fingers, the same gesture Dalton had used, the same faint humming vibration. "Where did you learn this?" Williams swallowed hard. "Sir." "Corporal Dalton, sir." Silence hung between them, heavy as sandbags. Morrison wasn't stupid. He'd known something about the March 12th incident didn't add up. Scout cars didn't just flip. Crews didn't just die without a scratch on their armor. Now the pieces arranged themselves with terrifying clarity. Instead of exploding, instead of berating Williams, Morrison did something no manual prepared him for. He pulled out a notebook. "Show me the installation," he said. "Sir, that's an order, Private." Williams walked him through every step: placement, angle, tension, concealment. Morrison wrote everything down: measurements, soil type, recommended wire length, concealment methods. By sundown, he had diagrams, calculations, and a sinking feeling that one of his corporals had accidentally solved a tactical problem that had bled them for months. "How many of these have you set?" Morrison asked. "4, sir." Results: 1 confirmed hit. Commander KIA. Crew captured. Morrison closed his notebook slowly, like someone holding an unexploded shell. "The field manual doesn't authorize this method," he said. "No, sir. I ordered Dalton not to attempt improvised anti-vehicle techniques." "Yes, sir." Morrison looked out at the road. In the distance, artillery rumbled like an approaching storm. Men were dying every day. And here, in front of him, was a solution that required nothing but wire, 2 shovels, and courage. "Show me 2 more setups before dark." Williams blinked. "Sir." "That's an order, Private." By April 10th, Morrison had documented 17 separate tripwire sites across the company's sector. He interviewed every soldier involved, tallied results, traced angles and distances, with the intensity of a man suddenly aware that he'd been wrong. His findings were brutal in their simplicity. 87% of vehicles hitting the wire were disabled. 0 friendly casualties. Total cost: 30 feet of wire and 2 shovels. He compiled a 3-page report: technical specs, tactical recommendations, statistical validation, and sent it up the chain on April 12th. The answer came back April 19th. Method unauthorized. Discontinue immediately. Violates field manual regulations and engineering safety standards. Morrison read the memo twice. Then he folded it neatly, placed it in a drawer, and ignored it. Because out here where the mud swallowed boots and artillery swallowed men, the manuals didn't bleed. His soldiers did. The tripwires stayed. The casualty numbers dropped. And officially, nothing was happening. But numbers tell their own stories. February 47th, killed by reconnaissance. March 12th. April 3rd. Reconnaissance sightings fell from 147 to 34. Artillery strikes from 203 to 58. The math was undeniable, even if the brass pretended not to see it. Someone higher up finally did. Colonel Anderson, Division Intelligence, pulled the casualty reports, circled the patterns, and sent investigators to the front. They found the wires within 2 days. And Anderson made his own quiet choice. No approval. No punishment. No orders. Just a deliberate bureaucratic look away. In May, the 34th Division was pulled off the line for rest near Naples. Actual beds, hot food, the luxury of silence at dawn. Dalton barely had time to exhale before receiving orders to report to division headquarters. He walked into a canvas command tent, wearing the cleanest uniform he owned, still stained from battles weeks old. Colonel Anderson stood waiting. "Corporal Dalton," he said, "I've read the reports about your wire method." Dalton said nothing. His hands twitched, expecting handcuffs. "I'm not here to punish you," Anderson continued. "I'm here to ask you to train others." Dalton blinked. Of all the outcomes he'd imagined, this was the one he least believed in. "The 36th Division is taking over your sector. They need a way to counter reconnaissance. The official anti-tank school takes 3 weeks and requires equipment we don't have. Your method takes 1 night and materials we already issue. It won't be official. It won't go in the manuals. But it will save lives." Dalton nodded once. "Sir." "Yes, sir." And with that, A quiet, unauthorized invention became a shadow doctrine, taught not in classrooms, but in midnight fields, shovel-to-hand wire biting into palms. Dalton spent the first weeks of June 1944 doing something no one had ever trained him for, standing in front of groups of skeptical soldiers, scouts, snipers, reconnaissance teams, and teaching them how to weaponize a piece of wire. At first, the men laughed under their breath. Wire couldn't stop armor. Armor crushed wire. Everyone knew that. But then Dalton laid out photographs: German scout cars, flipped like toys' wheels, still spinning in the air. Crews dazed, alive, captured. He showed them the statistics. He showed them the math. And slowly, the room changed. The cynicism faded. The questions began. By July, the method had spread beyond the 34th and 36th. Whisper by whisper, foxhole by foxhole. It traveled across the Italian front like a rumor the brass couldn't stop, and the infantry wouldn't let die. No manuals, no official sanction, just a quiet revolution in the mud. Conservative estimates later credited Dalton's method with disabling or destroying 43 German reconnaissance vehicles between March and August 1944. Each of those vehicles represented artillery strikes that never happened, patrols that never returned, firemen who didn't die in the dawn fog. Engineers would estimate years later that 300 to 400 American soldiers likely survived because one corporal ignored the rules. But Dalton's name appeared nowhere. Not in reports, not in commendations, not in the footnotes of after-action reviews. The Army preferred the official explanation: improved defensive awareness, enhanced anti-armor capabilities. A tidy phrase that erased the truth that a single enlisted man solved a tactical problem the engineers hadn't. Dalton didn't mind, or maybe he did quietly, in a place he never spoke about. But outwardly, he simply finished his assignment, boarded transport home, and let history move on without him. He survived the war, discharged in November 1945, with the rank of sergeant and a combat infantryman badge. No medals for innovation, no interviews. He returned to Gary, Indiana, and in January 1946 went back to U.S. Steel as a switchman, the same job, the same tracks, the same tools. He married Dorothy from East Chicago. They had 3 kids. He rarely spoke about Italy. When asked, he said only, "I did my job and I came home." Once a year on March 12th, the phone would ring. Morrison, Williams, Jackson, the men who had lived because of a strand of wire stretched across a road. They would talk for a few minutes, remember the fog, the fear, the scout cars, the silence that followed when the wire did what no bazooka could. In 1963, a military historian researching unexplained German reconnaissance losses in Italy stumbled onto a pattern: dozens of unexplained rollovers concentrated near Cassino. Interviews with veterans eventually led him to Dalton through Morrison. Dalton agreed to a single interview. He recounted everything: dates, locations, rough sketches on scrap paper. But he had one request: do not publish my name. The historian honored it. When the article appeared in the 1965 Journal of Military History, the innovation was attributed to unidentified NCOs of the 34th Infantry Division. Dalton died in 1987 of a heart attack in his living room, 63 years old. His obituary said he served in WW2 and worked 41 years for U.S. Steel. That was it. Nothing about Cassino. Nothing about the hundreds of lives his idea saved. Dorothy knew he had done something important in Italy, but he never told her what. And yet the method outlived him. In 1949, Army engineers quietly folded the principle of axle height wire obstacles into official doctrine. Decades later, variations of it appeared in counter-IED measures. The idea remains simple, brutal, effective. Sometimes the best weapon isn't the one the manuals approve. Sometimes it's the one a corporal invents because no one else will. Innovation in war rarely comes from conferences or committees. It comes from the mud, from the enlisted ranks, from soldiers who refuse to accept that their friends must keep dying. History remembers the generals. But wars are won, and sometimes saved by men like James Dalton, who broke the rules not for glory, but for the men beside him. And maybe that's why The Wire is still taught, why the method still exists, why the ghost of one corporal from Gary still lingers on roads he never walked again. Because some heroes don't need medals. They just need someone someday to tell their story. When I look at Dalton's story, I'm struck by how history so often overlooks the quiet ones, the men without rank, without power, without medals who still manage to bend the course of a war, with nothing but desperation, instinct, and a refusal to watch another friend die. His invention wasn't polished, wasn't approved, wasn't even legal, but it was born from the rawest truth of combat, that survival sometimes depends on the courage to break the rules when the rules are already broken. Dalton never asked for recognition. He never demanded credit. Yet countless men lived because he trusted his own hands more than the doctrine in his pocket. And I think that matters. Not just as a footnote in military history, but as a reminder that humanity, even in war, is often saved by those who choose to act when no one else will. If stories like this speak to you, stories about the hidden corners of World War II, where ordinary people did extraordinary things, consider subscribing to WW2 Secrets. It helps us keep these forgotten voices alive.